Okay, guys, thanks very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services at MedCommsNetworking.com, where you'll find information, resources, activities, for people who work in and around the global MedComms community, by which I mean people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing. You'll find lots of activity at MedCommsNetworking.com. You'll find a whole load of content now at NetworkPharma TV, where we've captured lots of recordings of these sorts of meetings and others. There's now 300+ videos, all sort of good content relevant to MedComms. If you're watching this, as many people do, because you're interested in joining MedComms and maybe a career in MedComms, then have a look at firstmedcommsjob.com, where again there's loads of resource specifically for people who want to know more about the business. So what we're doing, and at the moment we're doing it every week, we're having a webinar with interesting, relevant people, which we can capture, put on NetworkPharma TV. Today I'm absolutely delighted. We've got Ash, we've got Lucy, we've got Emma, who've come to talk to us about basically the point of today is to talk about life if you cross from agency into client type life. All three of you have been on the agency side. You're all three of you in pharma companies at the moment. I'll let you introduce yourself in a minute. The only thing I would like to start by saying is an important point, that this is going to be as open as discussions we can have, but I'd just like to make the point that all three of you have come along on the basis that you're talking in a personal capacity, and thank you very much for that, but views expressed may not necessarily reflect those of organizations you work for or work with. So hopefully we've just covered ourselves there, but we're going to have as open a discussion as we can about life, and a little bit of reflection on the difference agency to clients and so on. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about who you are, where you are at the moment, how you've got there, and then we're going to have a fairly open Q&A around what your life's like. So Ash, I'm going to let you kick off. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Peter. So hi everybody, my name is Ash Dunne. I'm currently Associate Director for Medical Communication at Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany. Lucy's smiling because has already anticipated that particular issue. So there are two Mercks, separate companies. I'm in the Merck based in Germany, which is known as EMD Serono in the United States, and Merck in the rest of the world. So I've been with Merck KGaA permanently since only since 2019 actually, but prior to that I was working providing maternity cover while still in agency for our publication manager who went off on maternity leave. So I was a senior medical writer at the time, and I'd been working with Merck for a couple of years, and when the publication lead went off on maternity leave, they needed some additional support. So I started providing that support, still based in agency, as I say. And then that seemed to go quite well, and I was offered the opportunity to make the move over to industry. So I did, and I've been living in Germany now since 2019. I moved over probably about 3 or 4 months before the pandemic hit. So I moved over and then have spent the majority of my time working from home anyway. So that's a brief summary of who I am and where I am now.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Ash. So Lucy, you're next in alphabetical order. So let's do the same thing. Tell us who you are.
So I work for MSD, whose parent company based in the US is Merck and Company Inc. So that's the confusion. The interesting thing is that originally they were both the same company, but it started in Germany, but over the years have gone their own ways. I've been with MSD also about 4 months before the pandemic started, since the end of 2019. Before that, I was with Roche based in Basel. I'm currently based in Switzerland. And before that, I was with Amgen's European operation, based in also in Switzerland. I came on a slightly different route into pharma because I started in, my journey is very different to most people's. I started in agency in Asia. So I was with the Asian arm of our of Excerpta Medica, working with the whole of Asia down to Asia Pacific down to New Zealand, but we didn't cover Japan, and then Indonesia across to the Middle East. So a vast region of what, when I moved into pharma, they called emerging markets. And I was kind of thinking, emerging, we've been working with them for quite a while. And then I moved to our global operation based in Amsterdam and was about a year there, and then went freelance. And so as a freelance, I worked not only with agencies, but also with pharma companies. So I got to see different pharma companies, different agencies, and it was from freelance that I got bored of working on my own. I wanted to be back in a team. I reached out to a couple of people on LinkedIn and landed a job in Switzerland with Amgen. So that's how I've come to be where I am.
Fantastic, thank you. And Emma, go on. You'll do the same thing from your point of view.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Leah, and I'm working at Ipsen, based in Oxfordshire in the UK. Mid-size pharmaceutical. I'm a global medical and publications and communications manager for oncology at Ipsen. I've been here for about 5 years now, I think. When I was agency side, I supported a few different clients, but the last account that I was mostly supporting was with Ipsen. And for a while I knew the manager was leaving, and for a while it didn't occur to me to consider the move, and then as it wasn't filled, it gradually became, well, actually maybe I'll do that. And so yeah, I moved client side and joined Ipsen, and before agency I worked in academic journals in London. Before I joined MedComms, and way back when I attended one of Peter's networking days in Birmingham, and spoke to people in MedComms and thought about that move.
Excellent. Okay. So look, I think it's stating the obvious, but we've got three interesting people here with loads and loads of experience. I'm quite liking to emphasise at the moment, probably needlessly, that this is a global community, and it's great because we've got three people here from 3 different countries, representing global activity, and with a huge amount of global experience behind. I think for people certainly looking at MedComms and thinking, what's it all about? That's maybe not a bad message to keep going on about. We're going to run this as a completely open Q&A. We don't quite know what's going to happen. I'm very keen that the members of the audience who are watching us today put in some questions and discussion points, and we'll weave that into discussion. I just wanted to start with, well, let's start with just one, just to cover this off, okay? Which I don't think we made entirely clear, but I just think it's an interesting point. Ash, you said you started on the writing side, didn't you, in agency land? Lucy, I guess you've implied it, but you were on the writing side, weren't you? And Emma, sorry if I missed it, but I think you were writing side as well, weren't you, on agency side?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, excellent. And so let's just reflect a little bit, okay? Let's not make a meal out of this, but for the last year, again, you've touched on it, Ash, particularly in terms of your move. You're all working at home. It's been a disrupted year. Things have been very, very different, haven't they? Can you maybe give us a little bit of reflection from sitting where you are at the moment, how things have changed in a sort of MedComms terms within a pharma company? I guess you're not traveling to conferences in the way you used to, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to bounce around a little bit here, and it might be a little bit samey, but I just think it's worth reflecting at the moment. So Lucy, I'm going to go with you. I'll just bounce around a bit, but Lucy, just what's happening in pharma at the moment from your point of view because of the disruption of the last year?
My current role is very much working with the countries within our region, which is vast, finding out what they need and what their needs are. And my expectation when I joined the company is that I would meet these people face to face at conferences and also going and visiting their offices. When I first joined, I went to 3 countries and met people in 3 different offices, and then it all shut down. And so I have never met most of my colleagues face to face. But the vast majority of my day-to-day work is probably not hugely different to what it would have been, because I work in a regional role, working both with my global colleagues across the pond and with my colleagues in the countries around the regions, and we wouldn't be sitting in the same place anyway. And so in that sense, the day-to-day hasn't changed, but the fact that I've never met my colleagues face-to-face is a difference.
Because you would just naturally do that, and the relationship side of it would just come without you even thinking about it.
Yeah.
And but so it's just interesting, isn't it, how we're working a little bit differently. Emma, just again reflecting on the same question, how's the last year been?
Yeah, it's been a privilege really to be in this industry, because very little, there was barely a pause. I mean, there was an initial period when everyone around the world was, what's going on, what are we doing, how can we achieve this, and the odd congress was cancelled or shifted at really late notice to virtual and somehow pulled it off. And then from then on, everything just continued. And yes, it's been a bit strange working from the old nursery spare bedroom, but other than that, it's the same job. And yeah, the colleagues that I would sit with in the office, we have research labs in Oxfordshire, and so they weren't really people I was day-to-day working with anyway. So other than being away from people, you know, the people that I interact with, it's on these calls, and in general, just the external authors and people like that, the investigators that we get involved with, have become more familiar with our world, really. And some of those meetings go more easily now because everybody's used to connecting this way.
And just again, just tease this out a little bit. You're basically a pubs director, aren't you? You work in publications, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Just give us a sense, because some people might be watching things. Well, you know, a pubs director, you just sit in an office, and why would you go anywhere anyway? Because you're just either writing or you're managing publications. Just give me a little bit of sense of what the work actually involves. And it isn't just about an article in a magazine, is it? It's the Congress activity and so on. Just give us a sense of what I'm getting at, if you understand what I'm getting at there.
Yes, so this, I mean, it's a very varied work life. There is publication work, but I mean, the MedComms agencies, the writers and so on, are doing the actual writing that I used to do, and most of it is about interacting with colleagues in so many different functions, so many different places, understanding what they're doing. I mean, there are hugely complex timelines involved for getting data that need publication, and even more complex in the kind of COVID scenario, and therefore understanding what's going on with all those planned studies and keeping track of what's coming when. There's the kind of the publications side of it. You know, we have a publications team, there's different products, different colleagues work on different products. And so there's a whole aspect of what do we do in terms of publications, you know, what are our policies, what are we aiming for as a publications team? And then beside that, there's all the product specific and study specific work, and yeah, getting involved with investigator meetings and so on, and advisory boards, and understanding the data and what we're investigating.
So again, what you're getting at is the difference now versus maybe the way it was, same as Lucy was saying, is you just naturally assume you're going to be meeting people all the time, building relationships, and that's going to help the coordination process. Although maybe we're lucky enough to be in a business where actually it's turned out you can sit in one place and things can be done over Zoom and so on. Again, I'm just trying to get a flavour of the sort of the work at the moment. Ash, I'm going to same sort of point, you know, and I know I sort of, you know, you've touched on it. You've been stuck in a flat in Darmstadt for the last year, sort of thing. But from a work point of view, how have you seen the differences, or what just give us a reflection of how your work is at the moment?
So I think very much aligned with what Lucy and Emma have stated. I think the big thing has been, I think when you transition from agency into pharma, one thing that perhaps catches you by surprise is just how much additional work there is to do that's all about internal strategy, that's cross-functional meetings, that maybe you don't have any visibility of your publications clients when you're an agency. You don't have any visibility on all of that extra internal activity that's ongoing. So those would be the kind of things where in the before times, you would typically meet in person, you'd have a big conference room, everybody would be sitting there, there'd be flip charts, you'd be drawing things out and doing the odd team building exercise to keep everybody awake. And then, of course, now it's immediately, you become much more siloed in a way. But because we live in the age that we live in, it's, you know, we're very fortunate that this has occurred now and not 20 or 30 years ago, because we are able to still maintain that level of communication. I think that for some types of activities, that works very well. I do think there are certain activities that need to be conducted face to face, and I'm sure everybody's experiencing that Teams fatigue or Zoom fatigue or whatever fatigue it is. And certainly with the virtualization of congresses, I think at first there was a sense of, oh, this is new and we can try new things, but certainly in talking to the HCPs, I know everybody was desperate for them to go back to being face to face this year, but it's not looking that way. And I mean, in terms of that initial impact of COVID, I think that I remember seeing friends who work in other industries and other sectors, you know, were badly hit by COVID in terms of their job, and I felt very fortunate. But at the same time, I sometimes thought, oh, I wish my life had got quieter in the pandemic, because it did not, because we had to adjust to this sudden virtualization of all the congresses, which required a very different approach. And we were very fortunate to have great support from the agency in adapting to that. But also there was the downstream effect of obviously working with HCPs, in my case, neurologists. It was a surprising number of those HCPs got redirected into going back into general medicine and having to provide support in general medicine during the COVID crisis. So we also had to do a lot more management of our HCPs and authors to make sure that we weren't overburdening them during the worst of the COVID pandemic, but still keeping certain urgent publications moving forward where possible.
Yeah, and I can imagine there being a bit of a conflict in some of those situations. You know, I want my paper approved. Yeah, and they're going, oh, yeah, but I'm dealing with a COVID patient. Okay, right. So that's sort of obvious, but you know, clearly part of the game. Let's go right back to the beginning. And again, all three of you, I'm going to ask. You know, I just want to get a sense of why you came into MedComms. I'm going to start with Emma. Just try and take us, and you've all come up through the writing route, so let's bear that in mind. But just a little bit of a sense of what were you thinking when you joined MedComms in the first place, out of interest?
So it was back in PhD days that being in a lab, you know, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed science, but I realized that, you know, the lab wasn't for me, and I was reasonably good at writing about what I was doing in the lab, and actually, you know, communicating it was where my strength was, rather than doing the actual experiments. And so, yeah, I went into the academic journal route, and that was simply by opportunity. A role came up that was close to my PhD, and I heard about it through contacts, and joined Nature Publishing Group in London. And then whilst there, I guess, I mean, MedComms, there's opportunities around the country and different places, and it had been a potential career from the PhD stage. I just had a kind of interlude with a journal until I decided it was time to leave London, and so then moved into agency.
Okay, which makes sense. So, and is a fairly traditional route into MedComms, medical writing sort of thing. Ash, again, just reflect a little bit on that initial stage.
Yeah, so I think that I was aware that I really liked working closely with data, and that I liked getting stuck into the nitty gritty of how to communicate that, and I always enjoyed that element of it. And I'd never even heard of medical writing, but as it happened, one of my closest friends had been working as a medical writer for a couple of years, and so I'd just been talking to him about it as a career, and it intrigued me. So I was still working in the lab at that time, and I started making some inquiries, and it took a little bit of time to get a foothold. But I knew it was one of those things where as soon as you get your foot in the door into MedComms, then everything else opens up. So that initial barrier to entry, which in some ways wasn't helped by the fact that the the pharma company in the northwest of the UK had just unfortunately released a few people from their contracts. So suddenly agencies had this pick of ex-pharma people. So it suddenly became much more difficult to break in up north. So I was actually offered an opportunity down south. So I relocated to take that opportunity. And sure enough, as soon as I'd started working for an agency, all of the agencies in the north suddenly started expressing interest. So I was then able to relocate back up north, which was where at the time I felt like I belonged.
All right, okay. And an interesting point you make there, which I do say to people quite a lot, but it's nice to have you say it, is that it's amazing if you can get in, the doors open up quite dramatically. It's getting I mean, but it's very competitive, or it can be very competitive to get in the first place. And Lucy, again, similar sort of question, but I'm interested. You went freelance, so you know, just what was in your head when you're coming into MedComms, but also just out of interest, what was it that took you in the freelance direction?
I joined MedComms back in 1994, when probably some of the people on this call were just about at primary school. And I joined not after PhD, but after postdoc. I really wanted to find out that I did hate lab work.
Right.
I moved into, I did a couple of pieces for one agency while I was still doing my postdoc, just kind of freelance. And then I don't know what the link was, but I ended up working with a different agency, doing some freelance stuff, just turning up in the morning and saying, what do you need help with? And then when a colleague left, I got a permanent role. And it's kind of moved from there. I moved back to the UK for family reasons and was looking for a position, but because I'd had management experience but no writing experience in the first instance, nobody would give me a management position when I was managing writers, but nobody would give me a writing position because I'd been a manager. So I ended up going to Amsterdam for a year to work with a sort of sister agent, a sister part of the agency, and then that really didn't work out. The whole of that organization was going through a really difficult patch, and it wasn't for me. And so that's what made me go freelance. But I spoke to several of my freelancers at the time and said, you know, am I being stupid here? Should I be looking for something different? What's going on? And they said, if you get yourself a fax machine back in those days, and a computer and a phone, you'll have people banging on your door to come in. And that's pretty much what happened.
Okay. So look, we've got, I mean, I find it fascinating. Each of you got fascinating backstories. I don't want to get too bogged down in the old days, because what I want to talk about is where you are now. So let's assume you've grown up in the way you discussed within the agencies and so on, and we've started to hint at the move into pharma. But let's just be a bit more specific. And again, I'm just going to keep bouncing around here. There was a point where you were, for slightly different reasons, I think, in all cases, thinking, well, maybe the next step is into pharma. So let's just think pros and cons. Emma, maybe let's start with you. Did you go through a process of pros and cons? Can you share the sort of thinking that went on there? What might have appealed? What worried you?
Yeah, I guess some things probably did worry me. It had never really been on the horizon. As I say, the writing side of things, that had always been an intention. At sort of school level, I'd always been between communication. I liked English, I liked science, you know, it was both ways. And so somehow communicating it seemed the obvious way. And it had never really been on the horizon to go into industry. And then when the opportunity came up, as I say, when it, you know, I was aware of it without considering it for quite some time. And then it was probably opportunity. It was I had a conversation with my husband where he said, well, actually, I fancy changing. And he wanted to change his job too. And so that brought on the whole idea of a move. And then suddenly within about 2 days, it was like, well, I'm going for this then. And it was a whole change of career, and, you know, not a complete change, but it was an unexpected change of direction. And then it was a little bit intimidating, but but it was interesting. There was so much I didn't know and so much I hadn't considered that I didn't know.
About working within a pharma. So I'm just trying to follow
yes. And yeah, what was different client side? You know, I had a very long opportunity where I could have probably found out a lot more. And then in the end, because the position, you know, it was a long lead time. The person was leaving with a lot of notice, but actually by the time I was considering it, it was coming up very soon. And so then the whole process, once I made up my mind, was very quick. And so yeah, I could have done a lot more to prepare myself and consider the pros and cons before. But instead, I just kind of one day made the decision, went for it, got the post, and then found out on the other side how many things I didn't know about before.
Okay, which we'll come back to in a minute. But it's just interesting. Opportunism comes into a lot of our careers, doesn't it? Let's face it. So it's being in the right place or the wrong place at the wrong time or right time or whatever. I lost track of my words in there, but you know what I mean. And I personally have never sat there and sketched out a career plan in the way that some people I know have tried to do it. I don't get how that works because opportunities just arise. But you've touched on a few points there. Let's try and invest. I'm going to investigate a little bit more with somebody else. Ash, you were talking again. You had the experience of having worked alongside or within the team, really, within Pharma, before you made that move. So you were, again, it wasn't quite as sudden there, was it? But what were you thinking in terms of, you know, if I do make this move, what again, pros and cons? I'm trying to get the pros and cons here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a move that was something I also hadn't really considered. Like a bit like you were just saying, Peter, I don't know that I ever sat down and mapped out, right, I'm going to do this, then this, then this, then this in my career. I just was very fortunate that the opportunity arose first within the agency I was at to provide this cover as an ad interim pubs manager, and then that Merck offered me the role on a permanent basis. And I think at the time, and I obviously discussed it with my wife because it meant a relocation, and we sort of had the attitude as a couple that this opportunity has kind of fallen upon me, and I've been very fortunate to get it. So the worst that happens is that I go and find out that working on industry side isn't for me, and that I go back to agency. But either way, it wouldn't harm my career to get that experience within industry. So for me, there was a bit of a calculated risk. And I think that I was aware that by virtue of the fact that you're working for a pharma company as opposed to an agency, it's always going to be a bigger organization. Bigger organizations always mean more internal politics, perhaps, and more good ideas that maybe don't always come to fruition. And so I was a bit anxious about balancing that, because by nature, I don't think I'm a particularly political person. I want to come in and enjoy my job and do what I do and do it well. I'm not really interested in the more careerist side of things, I guess. So I had a little bit of anxiety around that. But actually, I think that for the most part, I've been quite pleasantly surprised that it is broadly a very collaborative feeling. And you know, yes, it's a much bigger organization, but within the teams you work in, you still develop those close working relationships with people. So I think those initial fears that I had have largely been allayed. And I'm incredibly grateful that I got the opportunity, and I'm incredibly pleased that I took the opportunity, because I think one of the discussions I remember having with my wife before accepting was, in 5 years' time, I would regret not having taken the opportunity. But I wasn't going to regret having taken it, if you see what I mean, even if it didn't work out.
Okay. And I suppose, again, I'm going to state the obvious, which is none of you would be here if you were unhappy, sort of thing. Okay. So I think people watching this sort of have to bear this sort of thing in mind when we have these sorts of panel discussions, because I'm not bringing the grumpy people from Pharma online to talk about how bad it's turned out. So, you know, it won't always work out well, but it's lovely to hear that very positive experiences. Just out of interest, and just before I come to Lucy, and I'll ask bluntly the same question to Emma and Ash. Okay. And I'll start with Emma. Do you think the agency experience helps in your current role?
Yes, certainly in my
Yes or
current
no?
role. Yes.
Yes, it definitely does. And I think I'm right in saying, but I'm probably straying into areas I don't know enough about, that there's quite a number of you in your sort of position within the company who have come from an agency background. I mean, is that a conscious thing, do you think, or is just a natural way it's happened? I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but I'm just intrigued a little bit.
I think only people with agency background really have the experience of good publication practice and so on, and things that need to come into the role. And there's probably less movement between pharma companies in terms of people with pubs experience moving into those roles from another company.
Okay, so blunt. I mean, I'm sorry, I've lost it. But somebody was asking that question about whether that experience really was useful, and so you'd be absolutely going, that's absolutely useful, and indeed you're saying really quite important. Ash, are you going to say just nod if you like, but would you say exactly the same thing?
Yeah, I'd say more or less the same thing, and a lot of my colleagues within GMC here have agency background. But it's probably about 50-50 in terms of who does and doesn't have agency background. But I certainly think agency brings a certain perspective and knowledge into the role that is useful. But one thing I would also say is that I think that obviously coming from a writing role is useful, but actually there's so much project management and stakeholder management that I think people who work even on the account side or client side within agency could bring a lot into this sort of role. So it's not limited to the editorial team. I would say agency overall gives you a good overview of some of the key skills that you need to bring into the role.
Yeah. Okay. And Lucy, I'm going to come to you. And Tammy's, is it Tammy? Tammy's asked a couple of times now. So let's just talk about this: the experience of being a freelancer coming into pharma, and a similar sort of question, I suppose, in terms of how you found that move. But the specific question Tammy is asking: did you find being a freelancer a barrier to moving into pharma at the interview type stage? No barrier at all.
In fact, several of my clients specifically asked me to move into pharma while I was freelancing, and I wasn't ready to do so at the time. And it was when I came to interview, the only slight barrier that there might have been is that, of course, as a freelance, you're not managing people, and the role I was going for was people management, but I had people management in the past in my CV, and I'd been managing people not in a company perspective, but in other volunteer roles, and so I could bring that part to the interview process. But no, I would say that being a freelancer is not a barrier.
No, okay, all right. So that answers Tammy's question, I think. So now we're focusing on what you're doing and the sort of the pros and cons of being in pharma. A couple of questions have come in. Steve's asking about were you expecting? I think Steve's basically saying he was surprised when he went into pharma about just how much he had to act like an accountant. There's so much more budgetary type activity than he was expecting. You're all laughing at, well, I think two of you are anyway. Emma, you're not, but would you all agree that maybe that was a bit of a surprise? You've all touched on the fact there was much more happening in pharma than you're expecting. Is the budgetary side one of those things, Lucy?
Yes, the budgetary side is one of those things, although different companies have it set up differently. So obviously you have to set your budget, but what you're expected to do further down the line in the way of you set it and manage it, but do you have to do all the paperwork behind it? That will depend on the company that you're in.
Okay, Ash, you're nodding. Same for you?
Yeah, I mean, we have to sort of provide our projections of what we think our spend is going to be, and we do that on a quarterly basis, and then we have to put in a budget proposal for the following year. I would say, luckily, I probably have been relatively lucky in terms of not having to spend too much of my life doing budgetary stuff. But I think, again, and to my previous point about if you come from an account background, an account management background in agency, I think that side of things is, from a writer to suddenly having to look at Excel sheets of projected expenditure, I had no idea what I was doing to begin with, and there was very much a sense of just winging it. And so I think if you can bring that element of experience into the role, I think it sets you up quite well, because I still get a little bit fearful when I'm looking at an Excel sheet projecting numbers for the next year.
Okay. Emma, I'm going to start a slightly different question to Emma. I mean, just try and compare and contrast, your role here. How does it differ from being in an agency?
So the budget was something that didn't surprise me, because I was aware, that those things went on, and the kind of amounts that you might quote to a client when you're at your agency side and so on. It did surprise me a little bit that the projecting what you would need rather than somebody saying this is the amount you can have, and there's that kind of balance ongoing. The things that did surprise me, you're preparing a CV, getting ready for an interview, and you think, I'm a good collaborator, I'm a team player, I work with lots of different people, I'm good at talking to different kinds of authors from different backgrounds, from people from different institutions, but you don't get a sense of true cross-functional working until you go into the industry side. Right. And it is just the number of roles and the things that people are doing that you don't need to understand, but you have to sort of know where they are placed. And I think part of the biggest challenge of making that switch was trying to understand how much everybody is understanding that, because nothing sits still for very long either. So, the functions and roles are moving and people are changing, and understanding how an organogram fits together is not a fixed thing always. And so, understanding how much you should know and how much you don't know because you're new versus how much you don't know because nobody knows. That's and then you get a level of comfort with that of realizing that everybody's
so it's interesting. I mean, I for what it's worth, I went from biopharmaceuticals into the agency world, and I found that a huge culture shock and all sorts of things. But I think the point you're touching on there was one of the things that affected me a little bit, or I was very aware of. When you're within the pharma company, there are, like you say, so many people to deal with in different functions and all the rest of it. And you come into an agency and it's like, well, we've sent this in for approval, and it's like disappeared. And you think, well, I know because I've been there, that how many people in how many different places are going to have to rubber stamp this or something, and how difficult that process is. If you haven't been in there, you just see the doorway you're dealing with. It's quite amazing how it opens up. So several people have asked the basic question I was coming on to, which is, what do people back in agency land, what would you advise to people back in agency land that they should have a better awareness of, sort of thing? How can you help them? And maybe one of the things is simply just understand, at least acknowledge that this is through that doorway there's a huge organization, multifaceted and all the rest of it, and it's worth getting to grips with that and understanding it and taking some time to understand it. We could go on, but in a nutshell, is that just a useful thing to say to the agency guys? Is that what you would look back on and go, that would have been useful?
Don't underestimate your history and your knowledge. If your company and you and your account understand the process and the people involved, don't hesitate to suggest it to the client. They might have moved role or not be aware. And so, any background and help with that, making those connections is really useful.
Again, an important point, because again, it's a flippant thing to say, but quite often from an agency point of view, your clients are moving quite a lot. The people you're dealing with are quite a lot. Sometimes you can quite easily end up in a situation where the agency person actually knows more than the client person because they've been around working on the account for more than 6 months, sort of thing. And again, it's interesting. So then it's sort of interesting to think about that rather than getting irritated about it and the fact the client keeps moving every 6 months and that must be a conspiracy. It's part of the fact that you're in a big company, and that's sort of what happens in big companies. But that brings up some issues. One question came in somewhere up here. Hannah was asking, Lucy, you get more involved in the strategic side, presumably by definition. All of you are strategizing and managing people in the agencies rather than sitting there writing, for instance. Lucy, am I making an obviously stupid point sort of there?
I still do quite a lot of slide deck prep, because sometimes it's just quicker to do it myself than to send it out to the agency. But that's partly because I spent 10 years doing it as a freelance. I can do it almost in my sleep. One of the things I would say is, when I was a freelance, I thought I was the bottom of the food chain, and I wanted to move into pharma partly not to be the bottom of the food chain anymore. And what I discovered was I was only one step up from the bottom of the food chain. Because actually the farm, as you say, pharma is so big, and although you've got the title of publication manager for X product or whatever, actually, depending on where you sit in the organization, publications may not be seen as important. MedComms is seen as more important, or commercial is seen as more important, or access is, and all of those, the importance changes over time. But there is a huge kind of disconnect between you think you're going to be going in and strategizing, and you are involved in setting strategy, but you're not the strategy maker. You're involved in that process because it's a huge organizational animal to make develop strategy.
Right. Okay. So again, from an agency point of view, when you're getting cross with that client that's making decisions or saying something, you've got to again understand that there's this massive organization. They're probably quite frustrated themselves, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So okay, Gillian's asking, let's touch on this. We're going to start running out of time in a minute, but Gillian's asking, what good things do you miss about working in MedComms, by which I presume she means in the agency side? Let's just specify. What do you miss about working in an agency? Who wants to go first? Lucy again, go on. Anything or nothing?
I don't think I miss anything particularly about working in, oh no, the one thing I miss about working in agency is that you can make decisions quickly. Nothing happens quickly in pharma, even when they start talking about agile. That is an ambition, it's not where they are.
Interesting you say that, because I would imagine you would go further than that and saying, in your instance, and it was so much quicker when I was a freelancer. Any organization slows anything down. So you go even a small organization, but it's interesting. So you can sort of see it as a freelancer going, well, I could just do this now, and you've sort of said that's carried over into your life. But yeah, okay. So that's interesting. Ash, go on. You answer the same question. What do you miss about versus working in an agency, if anything?
Probably variety, in the extent that, working in agency, I was never working with just one client. Mm-hmm. I was always working on with a few different clients, to a lesser or greater extent. So I was covering different therapy areas at any one time. So I think during my agency career, I worked on quite a few sort of interesting therapy areas and worked on a variety of different projects, and adapting to what every client is different, and adapting to what the clients wanted was always a challenge I quite enjoyed. Not every time, so some clients are just bad to work with, and I always try and keep that in mind and hope that I'm not one of those clients. Right. I think that just thinking back to one of the earlier topics as well, one thing I really realized working client side is that I used to get frustrated with last minute requests from industry, from the publication managers, but I now realize that that's because that request has been filtered through 4 or 5 different people before it hits the publication manager, but the deadline has not changed during that filtering process. So by the time you get to pass it on to the agency, that deadline might be really close, but it just hasn't been communicated swiftly through the organization. So yeah, I don't miss having to deal with those requests, but now I make them.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Okay. Hopefully you make them a little bit more nicely than you would if you hadn't got that experience. Yeah. Emma, again, I'm gonna wrap up on this one. So it's just a nice way to just reflect a little bit. So what do you miss about, if anything, versus being in an agency?
I miss having a really chunky write to do. If I had a manuscript first draft that needed doing, and that was the clear priority that day, and that's what I'm going in, that's what I'm doing, and I'm just looking at those references, looking at that data, and I'm getting that plotted out on a screen, on a page, and just really focusing on that, and just sort of having a clear one task that I'm focusing on, and that being the only thing that needs doing right now. Yeah, that doesn't happen.
Right. Okay. I'm going to wrap this up now. We could carry on. I know we could carry on. I could carry on anyway. And we touched on a lot of ground there, and I'm sure there's much more we could have done. And what might be interesting is to get some different sorts of pharma client types who've got agency experience, and like we've touched on from the account management side or something like that. It's interesting. The different paths you've had, the different experiences you've got. It's just fascinating listening to you talk. And I think, you know, I hope anyone who's just listening to this is just getting a sense of some of those differences and the challenges, but also you're all very happy, which is brilliant. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to say, for the purpose of recording today, I'm going to say big thank you to all of you for joining us, and to the audience for joining us. Clear message goes out to anyone who's there today or on the recording. Ash, Lucy, Emma, you're all very happy to hear from people via LinkedIn is an easy way of doing it. So please, anybody watching this, do follow up. That's great. If anybody's interested in what we're doing at MedComms Networking, then medcommsnetworking.com is the place to go. You'll find lots of these sorts of videos over at NetworkPharma TV. And if you're interested in the MedComms business, go to firstmedcommsjob.com. However, for today, I'm going to ask you all to give us a wave. I'm going to say goodbye, but members of the audience, you don't have to rush away because we've still got 10 minutes. And I'm going to still use that with some of these questions that have come in. So thank you very much, guys. For today, I'm going to say thank you very much. Give us a wave, say bye-bye. I'm going to stop recording. Bye-bye.